Look at this before it's too late. I beg you, don't just scroll past thinking this is another internet story or a tale to scare children. What I'm going to tell you today isn't fiction, not a parable or an elegant metaphor to explain bad behavior. What I lived through is as real as the ground you're standing on right now, as real as the air you're filling your lungs with as you listen to me. My name is Elena, and for years I built my life on a beautiful lie, a lie of concrete and glass that I designed myself, until death came for me and showed me what truly lies beneath our arrogance. I live in Valparaiso, Chile. If you know this city, you know it's a place of hills, of houses clinging to the slopes that seem to defy gravity, always gazing out at the vast Pacific Ocean. It's a city of impossible architecture and vibrant colors. I loved this city, but not for its history or its people, but because it was my canvas. I am an architect, or at least that's what my degrees hanging on the wall of my office overlooking the sea say. I spent half my life studying forms, structures, material strength, and aesthetics. I became obsessed with exterior beauty, with the perfect facade. I became an expert at hiding imperfections under layers of modern, minimalist design, but I wasn't always like this. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth or surrounded by blueprints for luxurious buildings. My story began much lower down, in the dust and noise of a humble neighborhood, where having hot water every day was a luxury. Before drawing skyscrapers, my hands knew a much simpler trade. I was a seamstress, my mother was, and so was my grandmother. I grew up among threads, needles, and scraps of fabric left over from the dresses of wealthy people. I learned to hum, mend old pants, and disguise the tears in clothes so they looked new. I hated that job. I hated it with all my soul because it reminded me every day that I was poor, that I was at the service of others, that my destiny seemed to be to live hunched over an old sewing machine, fixing what others discarded, that hatred for my origins fueled my ambition. I promised myself I would get out of there, that I would stop being the girl who mends clothes and become the woman who designs the world where those rich people live. I studied with fury, worked double shifts, swallowed my pride and exhaustion until I earned my degree, and when I became a respected architect, when my name began to be mentioned in connection with the most important real estate projects in the region, I buried the seamstress deep in my memory. I was ashamed of those hands pricked by needles. Now my hands only touched expensive keyboards and directed million-dollar projects. I'm telling you all this so you understand the size of my pride. I believed I was the master of my own destiny. I was a modern, empowered, rational woman. For me, life was about what you could see and touch. If I couldn't measure it, weigh it, or draw it on a map, then it didn't exist. And this is where my biggest mistake comes in. The mistake that almost cost me eternal life. I was one of those people who openly mocked God. I didn't just ignore him, I actively despised him. I remember many afternoons driving my new car along Costanera Avenue, changing radio stations and accidentally stumbling upon religious programs. I would hear broken voices recounting Christian testimonies, people crying as they spoke of repentance and how Jesus Christ had pulled them out of the mire. I laughed out loud, banged on the steering wheel mockingly, and thought they were just a bunch of ignorant fools. I told myself that religion was the consolation of failures, of those who didn't have the mental strength to succeed on their own. When I heard testimonies of hell or stories about people who had near-death experiences, I changed the station in disgust. What a way to manipulate people with fear, I thought. For me, hell was living without money in a poor neighborhood. For me, heaven was my luxury apartment in the upscale neighborhood of Vina del Mar. There was nothing beyond. Death was simply a blackout, a fade to black, the end of consciousness. There was no judgment, no throne, no absolute truth waiting for me on the other side. How wrong I was, how terribly wrong I was, and the price of that ignorance was the most absolute terror a human being can experience. My life was a perfect structure, or so I thought. I was 42 years old, in excellent health, with a rising career and a bank account that grew month by month. I didn't have time to think about salvation because, in my opinion, I didn't need to be saved from anything. I was my own savior. I had lifted myself out of poverty. I had built myself up, but the Bible says that pride comes before a fall, and my fall wasn't a gentle stumble, it was a catastrophic collapse. It all happened on a Tuesday morning. It was a beautiful day in Valparaiso, with the sun shining on the port's containers and seagulls squawking in the blue sky. I had an inspection visit to one of my most ambitious projects, a luxury residential complex we were building on one of the most exclusive hills. As the lead architect on the project, I liked to personally review the details. I was obsessed with everything being perfect. I didn't allow for mistakes. I arrived at the construction site in my white hard hat, my blueprints under my arm, and with that air of superiority that characterized me, I walked among the workers without really greeting them, just giving curt orders: move that, clean that wall is crooked. I felt powerful walking on the fresh concrete slabs, looking down at the city that stretched out below me. I felt like a goddess on my little brick and cement Olympus. I remember stopping on the third floor, on what would be the main terrace of a penthouse. The view was spectacular, the sea breeze whipped against my face, and I closed my eyes for a second to save my success. I thought, I did it, I'm untouchable. At that precise moment, as my ego inflated like a balloon about to burst, I felt something strange at the base of my skull. It wasn't pain at first, but a snap, like a tightly taut violin string breaking, a dry, internal sound that resonated within my head. I opened my eyes, confused. The landscape before me, that brilliant blue sea, began to distort. The straight lines of the buildings curved, the sun became a blurry smudge. I tried to call the foreman, but my tongue wouldn't respond. It felt heavy, as if my mouth were full of sand. Fear struck me before the pain. What was happening to me? I was healthy, I ate well, exercised, and took care of myself. This wasn't part of my plan. I tried to take a step back to lean against a column, but my legs had disappeared. They simply stopped responding. I felt my knees buckle and my body, that body I cared for so much and dressed in expensive clothes, collapsed like a sack of potatoes onto the cold, dirty concrete floor. The impact was sharp. I lay on my back staring at the sky. The workers rushed toward me. I saw their panicked faces peering over me, shouting things I heard as if they were underwater. The architect, she fell. The architect, call an ambulance. I wanted to scream at them to shut up, to help me up, that this was humiliating. How could they see me like this, lying on the floor, vulnerable? My pride kept fighting even as my brain flooded with blood. It was a massive brain aneurysm, a small, defective artery, a structural flaw in my own biological design that had been there silently, waiting for the exact moment to burst. There was no warning, no prior symptoms, only the sudden collapse. The pain came afterward and was unbearable. I felt as if a pickaxe had been driven into the back of my neck and was being twisted, but greater than the physical pain was the terror that began to take shape in my chest, because as my vision darkened, as the blue sky of Valparaiso turned a leaden gray, I began to sense a presence. It wasn't the presence of the workers, it wasn't the presence of the paramedics who were surely on their way, it was something else, something cold, something ancient. I felt myself being sucked inward, not upward, toward the light, as they say in the movies. I didn't feel a violent pull downward, toward the center of the earth. It was as if gravity had multiplied 1,000-fold just for me. My physical body remained there in the construction site, convulsing, but I, the real Elena, the consciousness, the soul, began to detach, and in that moment of separation, all my logic, all my atheistic arguments, all my intellectual arrogance crumbled like a house of cards, because I realized a terrifying truth. I still existed, my brain was dying, but I wasn't. I was more awake than ever, and what surrounded me wasn't nothingness. What surrounded me was a dense, heavy darkness that smelled of dampness and confinement. I tried to hold on to something. I tried to remember my bank accounts, my architecture awards, my car, my clothes, but none of it mattered there. They were smoke. The only thing that mattered was my own soul, and it felt dirty, burdened, incredibly heavy. This can't be happening, my mind screamed. This is a hallucination from lack of oxygen. It's a chemical reaction of the dying brain. I desperately sought a scientific explanation. I needed it to be science, because if it wasn't science, then those powerful testimonies I despised were right, and if they were right, I was in the worst possible trouble. Darkness closed in on me like a coffin lid. I no longer heard the workers' voices, I no longer felt the sun, I only felt that force dragging me down, through the ground, through the rock, through the foundations of the city I loved so much. It was a dizzying descent, and the worst part wasn't the fall itself, but the certainty, that horrible intuition that screams in your ear, that you're going to a place of no return. I remember thinking of my grandmother, the devout seamstress who always prayed for me, whom I never visited because her talk about Jesus bored me. I remembered her voice telling me, "Alita, man makes plans, but God has the final say." How that phrase bothered me. It seemed like an excuse not to make an effort, but now, falling into that black abyss, that phrase echoed like a court sentence. My plans were over, my time was up. I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel, I didn't see deceased relatives waiting for me with smiles, I didn't see a green meadow, I saw shadows, shadows moving in the periphery of my vision, shadows that seemed to have claws and whispered my name with a blood-curdling malice. "You're coming, Elena. You're coming." Fear transformed into absolute panic. I wanted to wake up, I wanted to open my eyes in a hospital bed and have a doctor tell me I was very lucky, but deep down I knew this wasn't a dream. The reality of death is unmistakable. It has a metallic taste, a specific weight. I knew I had crossed a line, I had died, and my destiny was not rest. I always thought the evangelical testimonies were exaggerated, that people made things up to get attention, but as I sank deeper and deeper into that suffocating darkness, I realized that words fall short. Human language isn't designed to describe the horror of being separated from the source of life. It's a loneliness that burns you, it's knowing you're completely defenseless, spiritually naked, carrying nothing but your sins and your pride. I, the architect who controlled every millimeter of her works, was now rubble. I was a collapsed building falling into the void, and what awaited me below wasn't a firm foundation. What awaited me was the place I had so often mocked, the place I swore was a medieval myth. Hell, if you're listening to this and you feel you're in control of your life, if you think you're young, strong, and successful, and that God is something for old or weak people, I beg you to listen to what follows, because I thought the same way you do just a few years ago. Months, I stood on top of the world, gazing at the sea, feeling eternal, and a second later I was plummeting into a nightmare I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Don't make my mistake, don't wait to see the darkness with your own eyes to believe it exists. My body lay there, sprawled on the cold slab of that building under construction, like an old suit that no longer fits. I saw it from above. That's the first thing that shatters your mind when you cross the threshold of death, of separation. I stood, floating a few feet above the ground, looking down with terrifying clarity. I saw my brown hair scattered across the gray cement. I saw my hands still clutching the air in a gesture of panic. I saw my designer clothes stained with construction dust. Everything I had identified as Elena, everything I had nurtured with creams, the gym, and vanity, was now an inert object, an empty shell. The most disturbing thing wasn't seeing my corpse, but the indifference I felt toward it. That body I had so idolized, that temple of ego I fed and clothed, suddenly seemed as irrelevant as a piece of garbage. But the relief of not feeling physical pain was short-lived. It was replaced almost immediately by an anguish that has no name in the vocabulary of the living. I tried to scream. I screamed at the foreman who came running toward me, his face pale. I yelled at the workers to stop looking at me with pity. "I'm here, lift your heads. I'm up here." I howled with all the force of my voice, but no sound came out, or rather, the sound that came out didn't belong to that physical dimension. They couldn't hear me. They passed right through me as if I were smoke. One of them, a young boy who used to sweep up the rubble, ran past to fetch water and passed right through my spiritual form. I felt an icy chill, an electric repulsion at the touch of its life, because I no longer belonged to the world of the living. I was an intruder in my own creation. The sky of Valparaiso, which minutes before had been a radiant blue, began to change. It wasn't that it clouded over, it was as if someone had placed a dirty filter over my eyes. The colors faded, the shimmer of the sea turned to a dead gray, like molten lead. The sunlight stopped warming me. I began to see the world as it truly is, without the grace of God, a somber, decadent, gray place, and in that gray, I began to notice things that my rational mind had previously filtered out. Shadows. They weren't shadows cast by buildings or cranes. They were entities, dark, dense masses that moved among the living, close behind them, whispering in their ears. I saw one of those things crouching on the shoulders of the chief engineer, a man I often argued with about budgets. The thing was like an oil slick with claws and seemed to feed on his worry and stress. I froze. My architect's mind, trained to seek logic and structure, collapsed. There was no equation that could explain this, no blueprint that could have foreseen the existence of these spiritual parasites. Then, gravity shifted. Up until that moment, I had been floating, observing the scene of my own death with a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity. But suddenly I felt a weight. It wasn't a physical weight like carrying sacks of cement, it was a weight on my conscience. I felt as if every sin, every lie, every act of pride, every time I had humiliated someone, every time I had mocked a Christian, became a lead weight strapped to my spiritual ankles. The force of attraction no longer came from the earth physical, but from much deeper. I felt the ground becoming transparent, immaterial. The concrete slabs I myself had designed and calculated to withstand earthquakes were now like vapor. I began to sink. I passed through the penthouse ceiling. I passed through the lower floors. I passed through the foundations. No, I don't want to go. I tried to grab onto the steel beams as I descended, but my hands pierced them. It was useless. I had no physical substance to stop the fall, and as I descended, I began to hear a sound. At first, it was like a distant hum, like rush hour traffic in a large city, but as I moved further from the surface, the sound became clearer. Screams, millions of screams, a chorus of wails, of broken voices, of howls of pain rising from the depths like toxic vapor. Fear turned into absolute panic. I knew, with an instinctive certainty, that I didn't need an explanation of where I was going. I didn't need anyone to read me the sentence. My own soul knew where I belonged. For years I had scoffed at accounts of hell. I said they were inventions to control the ignorant masses. I said the concept of eternal punishment was incompatible with modern reason. How arrogant I was, how foolish. Now, falling through the crust of reality, I realized that truth doesn't depend on our opinion. Gravity exists, even if you don't believe in it. Fire burns, even if you say it's an illusion, and hell is real, even if you spend your whole life denying it. The darkness became total. I could no longer see the strata of rock or the city's underground pipes. I was in an absolute void, falling at a dizzying speed. It was like falling into a bottomless pit, but with the constant feeling that something was waiting for me below, something hungry. In that fall, my life flashed before my eyes, but not like a romantic movie. I didn't see my successes. I didn't see the architecture awards. I didn't see the applause. I saw my filth. I saw the day I fired a secretary because she didn't fit the aesthetic of my office. I felt her humiliation as if it were my own. I saw the day I walked past a preacher on the street and spat on the ground in contempt. I felt God's pain in that moment. I saw the times my mother, with her seamstress's hands, gave me a Bible and I threw it at the bottom of a drawer without ever opening it. Every memory was a stab wound. There were no excuses. There in the darkness, I couldn't lie to myself. I couldn't say, well, but I was a good professional. Nobody cared about my profession there. My architecture degree wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. The only thing that mattered was made with my soul, and the answer was nothing. I had let her starve to death. I had suffocated her with pride. Suddenly, the fall stopped. It wasn't a soft fall. It was like crashing against an invisible surface, but hard as diamond. I lay on what seemed to be a rough, hot, vibrating floor. There was no light, only a reddish, oppressive gloom that didn't come from any specific source, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The air, my God, The air was unbreathable. It smelled of sulfur, yes, but that's an understatement. It smelled of rotten meat, of excrement, of old blood, of despair. It was a smell that got in your mouth and made you want to vomit. But you didn't have the stomach to empty it. I got up trembling. "Hello," I whispered. My voice sounded small, ridiculous in that place. "Is anyone there?" The answer was a laugh, a dry, metallic laugh that came from everywhere and nowhere, and then a voice that wasn't human, a voice that sounded like stones being crushed, spoke directly to my mind. "Welcome, builder. Here we also build, but our materials are different." Terror paralyzed me. My eyes began to adjust to the gloom, and what I saw made me wish I had ceased to exist forever. I wasn't in a natural cave, I was in a kind of immense, grotesque corridor. The walls weren't made of stone, they seemed to be made of something organic. They pulsed, moved slightly as if they were breathing with difficulty. I approached one of the walls, driven by a horrified curiosity, the same technical curiosity I had in life. I touched the surface. It was hot, damp, and viscous, and then the wall groaned. I pulled my hand back as if I had been burned. It wasn't rock, it was bodies, bodies fused, crushed, compressed against one another, forming the structure of that cursed place, faces deformed by the pressure surfaced, mouths open in an eternal and silent scream, eyes that rolled, searching for a relief that would never come. "This can't be." I'm backing away until I stumble. "This is a nightmare. I have to wake up, Elena, wake up." I hit my face, I tore out my hair, I felt the pain, I felt every tug, every blow. It was real, more real than the concrete, more real than the steel. I was in hell, and the worst part wasn't the monsters I hadn't yet seen. The worst part was the atmosphere, an atmosphere of absolute, total, and complete hopelessness. On Earth, even in the worst moments, you always have hope that tomorrow will be better or that this will pass. Not there. The very word tomorrow doesn't exist. You know with a clarity that shatters you that this is your eternal state, that you will never get out of there, that no one will come to rescue you, that God, whom you ignored and despised, has withdrawn his presence from that place, and the absence of God is the true torment. It is a burning cold, a loneliness so dense it crushes your bones. I began to walk or crawl through that living corridor. I was looking for a way out, even though I knew there wasn't one. My mind searched for a flaw in the design, a crack in the structure, something that could explode to escape. I was an expert at finding solutions. I fixed structural problems. There has to be an emergency exit, I thought frantically. Every building has an emergency exit, but this wasn't a human building. This was the repository for the souls who rejected life. As I moved forward, the heat increased. It wasn't fire yet, it was a dry, suffocating heat that parched my throat and cracked my skin. I began to hear footsteps behind me, heavy, dragging steps. I didn't want to turn around. I knew that if I turned around I would see something my mind couldn't process, but the footsteps were getting closer and with them a feeling of pure evil, an intelligent and sadistic evil that reveled in my fear. "We were waiting for you, Elena," the voice whispered again. This time right behind my left ear. "We have a special project for you, you're going to love it." I ran with all my might for that nightmarish corridor, treading on a floor that felt like raw flesh, hearing the wails of the souls that formed the pavement. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran fleeing from the truth, fleeing from my destiny, fleeing from myself, but in hell there is nowhere to hide. I reached an edge, the corridor ended abruptly in an immense abyss, and what I saw below, made my knees buckle and I fell face down, screaming until my throat tore, begging for a second chance that I knew I didn't deserve. I peered over that jagged edge and what I saw wasn't a bottom, there was no floor, no end, it was an infinite pit of blackness, an open throat that seemed to swallow any trace of hope, and I, who all my life had calculated the depths for the foundations of my buildings, who knew exactly how many meters we had to excavate to find solid rock, faced a fall that had no measure. There was no solid rock here, only emptiness. I felt a push. It wasn't a physical hand, it was the very atmosphere of the place, that malignant pressure surrounding me, that ejected me from the edge. I fell, and as I fell, the scream froze in my throat because the air turned solid. It was like falling through molasses, a dense, sticky substance that clung to my spiritual skin. It wasn't water, it wasn't wind, it was pure darkness. The feeling of confinement was immediate. Despite being in an immense space, I felt a terrible claustrophobia. It was as if the entire universe had shrunk to a coffin of my body. I felt the invisible walls of my own guilt pressing against my ribs. On earth, when you're afraid, you look for the light, you look for a way out. Here, darkness entered through my eyes, through my nose, through my pores. It invaded me, it violated me from within. As I descended through those layers of darkness, I lost track of time. I had been falling for a minute, a year, a century. In hell, time doesn't flow, time weighs. Every second is an eternity of full awareness, and in that endless fall, my mind, the tool I valued so much, became my worst enemy. It began to project my memories, but not like a nostalgic film, but like a legal accusation. I remembered a specific afternoon at the construction site. We were pouring concrete for the foundation of an office tower. I remember the noise of the mixers, the smell of fresh cement. A worker, an older man with calloused hands, approached me timidly during the break. He had a small Bible in the pocket of his dusty shirt. He said to me, "Architect, with all due respect, you build very big things down here, but you already have your house ready up there." He was referring to heaven, to salvation. I laughed in his face. I laughed with that polite, cruel laugh that educated people used to look down on the simple. I told him, "Don Manuel, take care of the mixing and leave the fantasy for Sundays. I build my reality with my own hands. I don't need imaginary lands in the clouds." I felt so clever saying that, so superior. Now, falling into this abyss where gravity was sin, I would give everything, absolutely everything I had, my degrees, my money, my beauty, to go back to that moment and listen to that man, because he had the truth. He, with his dirty clothes and rough hands, was wiser than I was with all my doctorates. He had a foundation. I had built my life on nothing, and now nothing was claiming me. The fall became slower, but more agonizing. I began to feel the separation from God. It's difficult to explain this if you've never experienced it. On earth, even the most convinced atheist enjoys the general presence of God, the rain, the sun, a child's laughter, the taste of a fruit, the relief of sleep. All of that is a gift of divine mercy. Sparks of His light touch us all, whether we believe or not. But as I descended, those sparks faded one by one. I felt the chill of absolute absence. It wasn't a temperature chill, it was an existential chill. I felt myself unraveling. Without God, the soul has no cohesion. Without His love that holds the universe together, I felt like a poorly designed building, about to collapse under its own weight. I began to understand that hell isn't just a place of fire, it's a place where life has been completely drained. It is death in its purest form, distilled and eternal. My God, I tried to think, but the thought shattered. I couldn't form a prayer. God's name burned in my mind, but it couldn't escape my lips. There was a barrier, a bronze ceiling above me that prevented any plea from rising. I realized with horror that my opportunity had passed. The door had closed, that door that had been open for 42 years, the door my grandmother pointed out to me, that the radio preachers reminded me of, that worker mentioned to me. I myself had slammed it shut with arrogance. Suddenly, I stopped falling. I didn't land on solid ground. I was suspended in a kind of grayish, misty mud. I couldn't see anything more than a meter away. The silence here was different. There were no screams at this level, only whispers, millions of quick, nervous whispers, like insects moving inside a wall. "Where am I?" I groaned. My voice sounded distorted, as if I were speaking inside a can. I looked at my hands. They were no longer the well-cared-for hands of an architect. They looked translucent, grayish, and trembled uncontrollably. Vanity, my driving force in life. Here, it was torture. I touched my face and felt my skin was taut, dry as old parchment. I began to walk blindly, groping in the darkness. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy, rotten. Each step released a stench of decay, of things that had been dead for a long time in a sealed basement, and then I stumbled. I fell to my knees, and my hands sank into the ground, but it wasn't earth. Pulling my hands out, I saw that it was covered in a black, viscous substance, and looking more closely in the gloom, I saw what made up the ground. It was rubble, but not rubble of brick and cement, it was rubble of lives. I saw half-buried objects that seemed to vibrate with infinite sadness. I saw broken watches, I saw rusted coins, I saw shattered diplomas, I saw blackened jewelry. They were the things for which people sell their souls. They were idols. I was walking on a landfill of human ambitions. Everything I had fought for, everything that had made me feel important, was there, turned into garbage, forming the pavement of this place of torment. Fear made me crawl, trying to get away. This isn't what I designed, this isn't what I wanted. I was miserable, but a clear and cruel inner voice answered me, yes, Elena, this is exactly what you designed. Every selfish decision, every act of pride, every moment of vanity was a brick for this place. You built your own cell. The truth hit me harder than any physical punishment. I was the architect of my own misery. No one pushed me here. I walked here with my eyes open, ignoring all the signs of danger. I kept crawling through that quagmire of cursed objects. I felt something watching me from the fog. I saw tall, thin silhouettes moving through the mist, watching me with predatory curiosity. They weren't coming yet, just watching. They knew I had no escape. They knew I was fresh meat in the realm of pain. Suddenly, the terrain changed. The soft, rotten ground gave way to something harder, more structured. I touched a cold, smooth surface. It felt like metal, but a metal that transmitted disease. I struggled to my feet and saw the fog begin to dissipate, revealing what lay before me. It wasn't a cave, it wasn't a pit, it was a structure. As an architect, my mind tried to process what I saw. Immense, twisted columns rose into the darkness above, arches that defied physics, angles that hurt my eyes. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the form, but the material. The structures seemed to be made of petrified bone and sinew. I approached one of the columns. It had the texture of a giant spine, and it had a pulse. The structure was alive. "Welcome to the Foundation," whispered a voice that seemed to emanate from the column itself. I recoiled in horror. That voice sounded like that of a dissatisfied customer, but distorted by 1,000 years of hatred. In that moment, I understood where I was. I had descended to the base, to the root. There was no visible fire here, but there was such a great oppression that I felt my spiritual bones were going to explode. It was the pressure of being at the bottom of the moral universe. The entire weight of the world's sin seemed to converge here. I looked around and saw other figures. They were souls like me. They were chained to the structures, or worse. They were becoming part of the structures. I saw a man, or what was left of him, fused to the base of a wall. Only his torso and head protruded. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and his eyes were wells of utter madness. I realized that he was part of the support structure. He was bearing the weight of that infernal architecture. No, no, no. I began to shake my head, backing away. I'm not going to end up like this. I am someone. I have a name. I am Elena. But here, names are erased. Here, identity dissolves into pain. I felt a cold hand grab my ankle. I looked down. A hand emerged from the ground, from among the rubble. It was a woman's hand with long, dirty fingernails. "Help me," the voice hissed from the ground. "You are new. You still have strength. Get me out of here." I tried to break free, kicking and screaming in disgust and terror. "Let me go." I screamed. "You are like us now," the voice said, its laughter like shattering glass. "You too built on sand, now you are part of the cement." I managed to break free, and ran toward the structures, looking for shelter, looking for something that made logical sense. But in hell, human logic is a mockery. The doors led to solid walls, the stairs descended only to ascend back to the same place. It was a labyrinth designed to break the mind, to humiliate reason. I, who prided myself on my functional and clean designs, was trapped in the design of chaos, and the worst part was knowing that the architect of this place knew me. He knew my deepest fears, my secret phobias. He knew I was afraid of confinement, of lack of control, of ugliness, and he had created this for me. I stopped in front of what looked like a window in one of those bone towers. I peered out, expecting to see something familiar, perhaps a distant view of the land. But what I saw chilled my blood more than anything that had come before. I didn't see a landscape, I saw a sea of liquid fire in the distance, a red horizon illuminating clouds of black smoke, and in that glow, I saw gigantic silhouettes, princes of darkness, walking among the flames like foremen, overseeing an eternal construction project. Fear transformed into a certainty of damnation. I was no longer a tourist in a nightmare, I was a resident. My citizenship had been transferred. I no longer belonged to Valparaiso, nor to Chile, nor to the land of the living. I belonged to this necropolis of suffering. And then I remembered Jesus Christ, but I didn't remember him with hope. I remembered him with a sharp pain, like someone who remembers the antidote after having swallowed the poison and knowing it's too late. I remembered his name, and I felt that name was the only real thing. Everything else, my buildings, my career, my fame was smoke. Only he was rock, and I had rejected the rock to build on my own ego. I let myself fall at the foot of one of those living columns, hugging my knees, trembling like a little girl in the dark. Why didn't anyone warn me? I am a lie. I had been warned hundreds of times, on the radio, in the street, by my family. The entire universe had screamed at me to stop, to repent, but I was too busy looking in the mirror. Now the mirror was broken, and all that remained was the naked, raw, and terrifying reality of a godless soul, trapped in the rotten foundations of its own damnation. And I knew the worst was yet to come, because in this place you can always fall lower, there is always a deeper basement, and I was about to meet the mastermind behind this construction. I got up from the floor with a difficulty that wasn't physical, but spiritual. The air felt like it weighed a ton. Every time I tried to inhale, I felt like I was swallowing glass dust. But what was before my eyes defied any logic I had learned in architecture school. I had spent my life studying the golden ratio, symmetry, the visual balance that brings peace to the observer. Here, in this place of torment, everything was designed to cause repulsion. The lines weren't straight, they were sickly curves that made you dizzy just looking at them. The angles weren't 90 degrees, they were sharp, cutting, aggressive, like knives pointing at you from every corner. I started walking down what seemed to be a main street of this city. There was no asphalt. The ground under my bare feet was a mixture of hot ash and something that felt like ground meat. With each step, the ground gave way a little, releasing a dark, foul-smelling liquid that stained my feet. I felt a deep disgust, a violent urge to wash, to scrub my skin with bleach until it bled. But I knew that in hell there is no water, no cleanliness. Filth is part of the punishment. I looked up at the structures that rose in the reddish gloom. They were grotesque skyscrapers, towers twisting upon themselves like giant intestines. And then, as I focused my gaze, as I forced my architect's mind to analyze the building materials, I let out a groan of horror that tore at my chest. Those buildings weren't made of brick, or steel, or reinforced concrete. They were made of people, souls. They were millions of compressed bodies, crushed against one another, fused into a solid but conscious mass. I saw faces protruding from the facades, mouths open in a petrified scream, eyes frantically spinning, searching for a relief that would never come. The columns supporting the entrance arches were clusters of intertwined arms and legs, bones broken and broken again to fit the shape the architect of evil had decided. I approached a trembling wall, driven by a macabre fascination. I had to know if it was real. I had to touch it. I placed my hand on the surface of the wall and felt warmth. I felt a heartbeat. The wall was alive. The wall was suffering. I heard a chorus of muffled moans came from inside the wall. Voices of men and women condemned to be bricks in the fortress of Help Me, whispered a mouth that protruded at eye level. It was the face of a young man, distorted by the pressure of the other bodies upon him. Get me out, please. Get me out. I've been here so long. I stepped back, wiping my hand on my clothes, feeling like I was going mad. I can't, I screamed. I'm trapped too. The architecture of hell is the denial of human dignity. On Earth, we build houses to protect people, to give them shelter and comfort. Here, construction has only one purpose: suffering. Everything was designed to make you uncomfortable, to hurt you. There wasn't a single flat place to sit, there wasn't a single dark corner to hide in. The architecture itself watched you, oppressed you, reminded you that you were an object, a disposable thing. I kept moving forward, feeling smaller and smaller, more insignificant. I, who thought myself so important with my white hard hats and my blueprints, now saw the true face of godless construction. It was a mockery of my profession. It was as if Satan were laughing at me, showing me, "Did you like building, Elena? Did you like designing spaces? Look at this, look at my masterpiece." I arrived at an immense plaza, surrounded by buildings that seemed to lean toward the center, as if they wanted to crush us. In the center of the plaza there was no fountain, no trees, no benches. There was a well, a circular hole from which a dense, yellow vapor billowed. Around the well I saw thousands of souls walking in circles, dragging invisible chains. They walked aimlessly, with vacant stares, bumping into each other, without apologizing, without looking at each other. It was loneliness en masse. They were together, but they were completely alone. I blended into the crowd, trying to go unnoticed, but in this place, no one goes unnoticed. I felt the gazes of the demons patrolling the area. They weren't like the ones depicted in medieval paintings. They didn't have tridents or long tails. They were shadow beings, tall, imposing, dressed in what looked like suits made of flayed human skin. They walked with a terrifying elegance, inspecting souls like someone inspecting cattle in a slaughterhouse. One of them stopped near me. He carried a kind of metal rod in his hand. I saw him strike a woman who had fallen to the ground from exhaustion. He didn't strike her in anger. He struck her indifferently, like someone moving a stone from the path. The woman howled in pain, a sharp, heart-rending sound that pierced my ears. "Get up," the demon said in a voice that sounded like boiling oil. "There is no rest here. Rest is for those at the top." I covered my mouth to keep from screaming. Fear made my legs tremble. I knew that kind of coldness. I had used it. How many times had I looked at my employees with that same indifference when they told me they were tired? How many times had I demanded more hours, more effort, without caring about their lives, their families, their health? "If you don't like it, leave," I would tell them. Now that same phrase echoed in my head, but there was nowhere to go here. You couldn't quit, you couldn't go home. This was your home now. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I began to feel an intense vibration. The surrounding buildings began to groan louder. The walls of living bodies contracted and expanded. I understood with an architect's instinct. Something was happening to the foundations. The entire city was reacting to something. "The foreman is coming," someone shouted in the crowd, and panic erupted. Souls began to run in all directions, trampling over one another, trying to find a refuge that didn't exist. I stood paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Who was the foreman? Why was everyone so terrified of him? Then I saw him. He wasn't a giant being, not a seven-headed monster, but a figure walking calmly down the main street, and in his wake, the ground opened up. The walls of the buildings bowed in a grotesque reverence. Wherever he stepped, he left footprints of black fire that wouldn't go out. What terrified me most was that his presence distorted space. As he approached, distances changed. What seemed far away was suddenly near. What was large became small. It was as if he had absolute control over reality in that place. He was the supreme architect of this nightmare. I hid behind a column made of human ribs, trying to make myself small, trying to disappear. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. "God, save me," I thought, but the thought crashed against the bronze ceiling of my past disbelief. I felt I had no right to ask for help. I had chosen this. I had built this brick by brick with my pride. From my hiding place, I saw the foreman stop in front of a group of new souls, recently arrived like me. He looked down at them with contempt, a smile that didn't reach his empty eyes. "Welcome to the construction site," he said. His voice echoed off the walls, making the embedded bodies scream in pain from the resonance. "Here, everyone has a function. Here, no one is useless. If you're not fit to suffer walking, you'll be fit to suffer holding. He pointed to a man who was crying on the ground. Two lesser demons grabbed him and dragged him toward a wall with an empty hole. The man kicked, screamed, begged for his mother, for his children. "No, please, I'll do anything," but there was no mercy. They lifted him and shoved him into the hole in the wall, and then I saw something that will haunt me for all eternity. The wall. The wall closed around him. The flesh of the other damned stretched like chewing gum and enveloped him, fusing him with the structure. The man ceased to be an individual and became part of the wall. Only his face remained visible, screaming, joining the eternal chorus of the architecture of pain. I covered my eyes, I covered my ears, I curled up in the fetal position, crying without tears, weeping without comfort. I am an architect. I repeated it to myself like a useless mantra. I design beautiful things, I build houses with light. I don't belong here, but the truth was relentless. I belonged there. My soul was shaped like those bricks. Selfishness, vanity, lack of love. I fit perfectly into that building. I felt a cold, heavy hand on my shoulder. I opened my eyes and looked up. A demon was standing over me, looking at me curiously. He had tools hanging from his belt, rusty hammers, saws with irregular teeth, butcher hooks. "You have good hands," the demon said, grabbing my wrists and examining them. "Fine hands. The hands of someone who never worked hard, but who commanded a lot. We're missing decorative pieces in the throne room." He pulled me up with brutal force. I felt my shoulder dislocate, but the physical pain was the least of my worries. The horror of being turned into an object, a living gargoyle to adorn evil, was worse than death. "Don't let me go!" I screamed, pounding on him with my useless fists. The demon laughed. "Here you have no voice, woman. Here your will doesn't exist. On earth you did as you pleased, here you do as you are commanded." He dragged me across the plaza toward the largest and darkest building of all. As I was dragged, my feet left furrows in the ash floor. I looked at the other souls. No one helped me. No one looked at me with compassion. In hell, compassion is dead. Everyone is trapped in their own bubble of torment. The selfishness we practice on earth becomes our absolute prison there. As they led me toward that black entrance that seemed like a giant mouth ready to swallow me, I remembered my life in Valparaiso. I remembered the sea breeze. I remembered the smell of coffee in the morning. I remembered the feel of clean sheets. Things so simple, so banal, that now seemed like paradise lost. How much would I give for a minute of boredom on earth? How much would I give for a glass of cold water? But there was no water, no breeze, only heat, the smell of sulfur, and the certainty that I was going to be walled up alive in an eternal structure. "Jesus!" I tried to scream, but the name caught in my throat. The demon slapped me so hard I saw black stars. That name didn't growl with hatred. Here, that name isn't spoken. Here, only hatred exists. He pushed me into the darkness of the building, and I knew I was entering the innermost circle of my nightmare. I was going to discover the true purpose of my empty life. I was going to build a foundation. I was going to build a wall. I was going to do nothing. I was dragged inside that colossal structure, and the darkness swallowed me. It wasn't an empty darkness, it was an inhabited, dense darkness that seemed to have weight and texture. I felt like I was crossing the threshold of an administrative office, but one designed in the nightmares of a madman. The air here was still, charged with a static electricity that made my soul crawl. The chaotic screams from outside were no longer audible. Here, the silence was absolute, a bureaucratic, cold, and efficient silence that frightened me more than the sound of wailing. The demon that was dragging me released me abruptly. I fell onto a polished floor, black as obsidian, which reflected my face, distorted by terror. I stood there trembling, not daring to look up. I knew I was facing an authority, not a legitimate authority like that of a judge or a police officer on earth, but a perverse authority gained through millennia of hatred and destruction. "Get up, buddy," a voice said. It wasn't a monstrous voice, it wasn't a growl, it was a soft, cultured, articulate voice, a voice that reminded me dangerously of my own when I spoke with millionaire clients in my Valparaiso office. That familiarity chilled me to the bone. I slowly raised my eyes. Before me was not a horned beast. There was a tall figure dressed in a robe that looked like it was made of old architectural plans, but upon closer inspection, I saw that the paper was stretched human skin and the blue lines were veins. His face was pale, angular, with a perfect and terrifying symmetry. His eyes had no pupils, they were two spheres of liquid mercury that reflected everything without showing any emotion. He was the foreman, the architect of this sector of hell. Approached me, pacing around like someone inspecting a defective model. His hands were long, with slender, elegant fingers, stained with black ink that smelled tartar. Elena said, savoring my name as if it were a private joke, "I've been reviewing your portfolio. Impressive, truly impressive." She gestured with her hand, and suddenly the air in front of us sparkled. An image formed in the void, sharp and colorful. It was my latest building, the luxury residential complex in the hills of Valparaiso. I saw it shimmer in the sunlight with its glass terraces and hanging gardens. For a second, my architect's heart felt a spark of pride. It was beautiful. I had designed it. Beautiful, isn't it? The foreman whispered, reading my thoughts. Clean lines, fine materials, a privileged view of the ocean. Anyone would say you created a little paradise on earth. Then his smile widened, showing teeth that were too sharp, like sewing needles. But down here we're not interested in the facade, Elena. Here we specialize in hidden structures. Let's see what's really holding up your building. He snapped his fingers and the image changed. The beautiful building became translucent, as if it had been subjected to spiritual X-rays, and what I saw made me reject with nausea. The foundations weren't concrete. They were black mud, and between the steel beams, writhing tracks, I saw fat, white worms wearing labels. I approached in horror and read the words written on the worms that devoured the structure of my great work: greed, vanity, contempt, envy, lies. "You see," said the foreman, pointing with his long finger, "your building was rotten before you laid the first brick. You built it to be admired, not to serve. You built it to prove you were better than your mother, better than your grandmother, better than your impoverished past. Every technical decision you made was infected by your ego, and ego, my dear, is the most flammable material there is." The image shifted again. Now I saw a scene from my office. I was sitting in my leather armchair, yelling at a young assistant who had made a minor mistake on a blueprint. I saw my face contorted with anger. I saw how I humiliated her, how I reveled in my power over her. I saw that girl leave crying, feeling like garbage. "That day," the foreman continued, "that day you laid a very important brick down here, remember? You felt powerful, you felt great. Well, that energy wasn't lost. We brought it here, we used it to reinforce the Wailing Wall." I fell to my knees, covering my face. "No, I didn't know. I just wanted excellence. I swear, liar," he shouted, and his voice changed, becoming a thunderclap that shook the ground. "You wanted worship, you wanted to be God in your little world. You scorned the true builder to play at being the creator? And now I'm going to show you your true place in the scheme of things." The foreman crouched in front of me, his face was inches from mine. He smelled of oil dust and dried blood. "You were ashamed to be a seamstress, weren't you?" he whispered maliciously. "You used to mend old clothes. You hated bending over. You wanted to rise up, to build skyscrapers to touch the sky." What an irony. Because here, Elena, you're not the architect. Here you're the thread, you're the broken needle, you're the dirty rag. He grabbed my arm and lifted me up as if I weighed nothing. He dragged me toward an immense table that occupied the center of the room. On the table were blueprints spread out, but they weren't building plans, they were torture plans, complex designs of machines and structures intended to maximize human pain. "Look." This forced me to look at a drawing. It was a design for a column made of intertwined souls. "I'm missing a central piece for this support. I need someone with resilience, someone used to withstanding pressure, someone stubborn, someone like you." The terror I felt at that moment went beyond the physical. It wasn't fear of being cut or burned, it was fear of annihilation, of losing my humanity, of to become a thing. He was saying that my eternal destiny was to be an inanimate, yet conscious object, bearing the weight of hell on my shoulders forever. "No, please," I begged, clinging to his leather robes. "I'll do anything. Let me sweep, let me clean, but don't put me in the wall, don't turn me into a brick." The foreman laughed, a dry, joyless laugh. "There's no negotiation here, Elena. On earth, you had 42 years to negotiate with God. You had thousands of opportunities every time you passed a church, every time you heard a Christian testimony on the radio, every time your grandmother said, 'God bless you.' Those were the bargaining offers, and you rejected them all. You broke the contract. Now I have the contract." He pulled a hammer from his belt. It wasn't an ordinary hammer, the hammerhead was shaped like an iron skull. "Let's see if you fit in," he said. He hit me. The blow was on my shoulder, but it felt like my soul was being ripped in two. There was no blood, there was an explosion of black light in my mind. I fell to the ground writhing. I felt my bones soften, become malleable, like clay. "She's still too stiff," the foreman shouted to the demons watching from the shadows. "Bring the mixture. We need to soften her pride." Two deformed creatures emerged from the darkness carrying a steaming bucket. The smell coming from that bucket was indescribable. It smelled like all my sins concentrated. It smelled like the lies I had told, the traps I had set, the money I had loved more than people. They emptied the contents on top of me. I screamed until I felt my throat tear. The liquid burned like acid, but it didn't burn the skin, it burned away identity. I felt Lena dissolving, I felt my memories being erased, my name losing its meaning. Only pain and guilt remained. "That's it," the foreman murmured, observing me with clinical satisfaction. "Now you're ready to be molded, now you're good building material." He lifted me up again. My body no longer responded. I felt heavy, dense, like a wet block of cement. He dragged me toward a wall under construction. I saw empty spaces waiting to be filled. I saw other souls already in place, only their eyes visible, staring at me with infinite sadness. "Look at your companions," the foreman said. "That one over there was a politician, that one was a doctor who performed back alley abortions, that one was a pastor who stole money from the church. They all thought they owned the world, they all built their empires. Now they are part of my empire." He pushed me against the gap in the wall. I felt the cold stone against my back. I felt the living structure of the wall begin to move, to extend tendrils of flesh and bone to ensnare me, to integrate me. "No, God, help me," I tried to scream, but the mortar they had poured over me sealed my mouth. The foreman approached with a trowel in his hand. He looked me in the eyes one last time. "God doesn't live here, architect. Here there are only us, the workers, and you've just clocked in for your eternal shift." He began to tape me brick by brick, darkness upon darkness. I felt my limbs being absorbed by the wall. I felt my heart synchronizing with the monstrous beat of the building. I was losing my human form, I was becoming wall. And in that final confinement, in that absolute claustrophobia, where you can't even move a finger, the truth fell on me like a 1,000-ton slab. This wasn't an arbitrary punishment, this was the logical consequence of my life. I had built walls around my heart for years, walls of pride, walls of indifference, walls of atheism. I didn't let anyone in, not even God, and now those walls had become literal. I was alone, completely alone within the crowd of the damned. I could hear the thoughts of the souls beside me on the wall, but I couldn't comfort them, nor could they comfort me. We could only share the horror. I heard the woman next to me repeat endlessly, "Why didn't I forgive? Why didn't I forgive?" I heard the man below shout, "Fire, I'm burning." And I began to repeat my own lament. I was a seamstress, I was a seamstress. I should have kept the needle, I should have listened to my grandmother. The darkness was complete when the foreman laid the last brick right in front of my face. I was buried alive, entombed in the architecture of hell. The heat rose, the pressure increased. I felt like I was going to explode, but in eternity you can't explode, you can't die to escape, you have to endure, you have to exist in the pain. Time passed, I don't know how much, maybe hours, maybe years. In that state of total paralysis, my mind began to shatter, madness began to seep through the cracks of my reason. I started to see hallucinations. I saw my grandmother's face crying. I saw the cross of Christ, but it was far away, unreachable, on the other side of an abyss that I myself had finished. Suddenly I felt a different vibration. It wasn't coming from the building, it wasn't coming from the foreman, it was coming from outside, from very far away, but it had a power that shook the very foundations of that prison. It was a sound that didn't belong to the vocabulary of hell. At first, I thought it was my imagination torturing me, but the vibration increased, the walls began to creak, the foreman stopped laughing. I heard his voice outside for the first time, with a tone of concern, almost fear. "What is that? Reinforce the doors, no one comes in here." But the vibration continued. It was like the sound of a trumpet, but made of pure light, and it pierced the darkness, pierced the walls of flesh, pierced my spiritual deafness. In my despair, trapped within that wall, I remembered something, not a blueprint, not a mathematical calculation. I remembered a song, a simple song my grandmother used to hum while mending the neighbor's clothes. "There is power, unparalleled power, in the blood he shed." I couldn't sing it with my mouth because it was sealed, but my soul, that wretched spark that still remained inside the brick that I was, began to hum it silently. It was an act of desperate rebellion. It was the last resort of someone who has already lost everything. And then the impossible happened. I was walled up. I was part of the structure. My consciousness was dissolving in that mass of collective pain, like a drop of water in an ocean of vinegar. I no longer felt my arms or legs as something separate from the wall. I felt the pressure of the other condemned, their guilt mingling with mine, their darkest secrets seeping into my mind like a shared poison. But in the midst of that absolute suffocation, that song of my grandmother's continued to vibrate. It was a faint hum at first. "There is power, power." My rational mind, that architect's mind that always sought logic, tried to shut it down. "What are you doing?" I kept saying to myself, "It's useless, you're doomed. God won't listen to you now. You had your chance and you wasted it building towers of vanity. He's an expert at using your own logic against you. He doesn't always need to lie to you. Sometimes you just need to remind yourself of your own mistakes to sink." But the heart is stubborn, and my heart, that spiritual muscle I had ignored for so long, clung to that melody like a shipwrecked sailor to a plank in the middle of a storm. I remembered my grandmother's workshop on the hill. I remembered the smell of hot iron and cheap fabric. I remembered her arthritic hands passing the thread through the eye of the needle with infinite patience. She always said, "Alita, when the fabric tears and can't be mended, the only one who can stitch the soul is the Lord." I laughed at her. I told her to buy a new machine. I told her that technology fixed everything, but there, embedded in a wall of raw flesh in hell, I understood that technology is useless when the problem is sin. There is no machine, no software, no money that can remove a stain from the soul. There is only one thing, a single substance in the entire universe capable of dissolving the cement of evil: blood. Not the blood of animals, not my own blood, the blood of Jesus. The buzzing in my mind grew louder. I stopped humming and began to shout it internally: "Blood, the blood of Christ." And then something extraordinary happened. The wall reacted. The material from which hell was made, that mixture of souls and evil, began to convulse. I felt the cement surrounding me heat up, but not with the heat of fire, but with a fever of rejection. The wall could not bear that thought. The name of Jesus acted like a lethal virus within the architecture of Satan. The foreman noticed it. I heard his heavy footsteps approaching my section of the wall. I felt his rotten breath near where my face should have been. "What are you doing?" he yelled with a mixture of fury and nervousness. "Shut up, stop thinking about that. That memory isn't allowed here, forget it." He slammed his fist against the wall right where I was trapped. The impact reverberated in my bones. But the pain, instead of silencing me, gave me more strength. I realized that he was afraid. The great architect of pain, the prince of lies, was afraid of a simple memory. He was afraid of the name. "I won't be silenced," I screamed in my mind. "You've already taken everything from me. You took my body, my life, my pride. But you can't take this from me." And then I gathered all the strength I had left. It wasn't physical strength, It was the strength of utter despair. It was the cry of a drowning child. I concentrated my entire being, all my anguish, all my regret into a single word, the word I had despised, the word I had used as an insult, the word I had forbidden in my intellectual conversations, Jesus. I don't know how the sound came out, my mouth was sealed by the infernal mixture. But the scream broke through the physical barrier. It was like a sonic boom. I felt my throat tear, my vocal cords burst. But the name came out, and it didn't come out like a normal word. It came out like thunder, like a cannon blast of pure light in the middle of the darkness. The effect was immediate and devastating. The wall creaked. A luminous crack appeared right in the center of my walled-up chest and spread up and down, ripping through the structure of flesh and bone. The other damned around me began to howl, but this time it wasn't from pain, it was from astonishment. The vibration of that name shook the foundations of the tower. Through the crack that opened before my eyes, I saw the foreman back away, covering his face. His parchment-like skin steamed as if acid had been poured on it. "Shut her up," he shouted to the other demons, "block the crack, keep the light out." The demons ran with their buckets of filth, trying to seal the breach, trying to bury me again, but it was too late. I was still screaming, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." I wasn't asking for justice, I wasn't asking for an explanation, I was asking for mercy. I knew I didn't deserve to get out, I knew my sins were as red as scarlet, but I also knew for the first time in my life that he was real. The structure of the building began to collapse, the bone columns bent, the ceiling, that solid darkness that seemed infinite, split in two, and through that opening came something my eyes couldn't process. It wasn't ordinary light, it was a light that had weight, that had authority, a white, golden, blinding light that swept away the shadows and the smoke of hell as if they were cobwebs. The suffocating heat disappeared in an instant, replaced by a coolness that smelled of rain, of ozone, of pure life, and in the center of that light, I saw a hand. It wasn't a giant, ethereal hand, it was a human hand, a working man's hand, a strong hand, and on the wrist, right where the palm begins, I saw the scar, the mark of a nail. That hand descended through the chaos, ignoring the demons that fled in terror like cockroaches when the kitchen light comes on. It ignored the complex architecture of it pierced the ceiling, pierced the stale air, and came straight to the wall where I was trapped. The foreman tried to intervene. He lunged at the hand with a sword of darkness, screaming blasphemies that made my ears bleed, but the hand didn't even pause. With a slight flick of a finger, it simply brushed the demon aside. The foreman went flying like a rag doll, crashing to the bottom of the abyss, howling with impotence. The hand stopped in front of me. I was there, dirty, broken, covered in the filth of my own sin, fused with death. I felt more unworthy than ever. I wanted to hide. I wanted to say, "Don't touch me, Lord, I'm rotten, I'm an arrogant architect, I'm trash," but the hand didn't hesitate. It grabbed me. I felt the firm fingers close around what was left of my spirit. The contact was electric, it was painful, yes, but it was a healing pain. It was like when they clean an infected wound with alcohol. It stings, but you know it's healing you, and then it pulled. The sound was horrible. It was the sound of something being ripped from its roots. I felt like I was being torn from the wall of hell. I felt the black scum trying to hold me back, sticking to my skin, shrieking to keep me from going. "She's mine, she's mine." The wall screamed, but the strength of that hand was absolute. There was no struggle, no competition. When God decides to save, hell has no say. With a sharp, violent pull, I was freed. I shot upward. I left behind my empty mold on the wall. I left behind the city of nightmares. I left behind the screams, the smell of sulfur, the eternal despair. We ascended at a dizzying speed. We passed through the strata of darkness. We passed through the earth. We passed through space and time. I clung to that hand, crying, trembling, not daring to look down, only staring at the scar on my wrist that shone brighter than the sun. "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me," I repeated endlessly. "Forgive me for my pride, forgive me for mocking, forgive me for my selfish plans, forgive me for not loving." And as we ascended, I felt something change within me. The filth flaked away, the layers of ash and death that had stuck to me in hell fell off like scabs old. I felt I could breathe again. I felt my heart, that heart of stone I had hardened over the years, turning back into flesh. The light became so intense I had to close my eyes. I felt a different kind of warmth now, not the burning kind, but the life-giving kind, the warmth of love